Standing in the checkout line at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. Jeans, work boots, a plain gray t-shirt with nothing on it. No logo, no design, no ink on his forearms, no ink on his neck, nothing visible anywhere. He's maybe 55, maybe 60. Hair going silver at the temples, the kind of face that has lived through something without making a production of it. A young guy at the register has both arms covered. Dragons and geometrics, and something in Latin script that winds from his wrist to his elbow. He's maybe 24, processes the transaction without looking up. The man pays, takes his bag. Walks out in the parking lot, he loads his truck. Pauses for a second in the autumn light. It looks at his forearms for a moment. Bare skin, a few old scars, the kind you collect from decades of actual work, and then gets in and drives away. Here's what nobody in that hardware store would have guessed. Thought about getting a tattoo. Once. He was 23. He went as far as sitting in the chair. He looked at the designs on the wall for a long time. And then he stood up, thanked the artist, and walked out without explanation. He has never been able to fully explain why. Not to anyone who asked, not even to himself. But the psychology underneath that moment, and the 40-some years that followed it, tells a story that most people have never considered. And it has almost nothing to do with pain tolerance, or conservatism, or fear of needles, or any of the obvious reasons people assume. Something else was happening. Something much more interesting. And if you've spent your life with clean skin in a world that increasingly expected ink, you might recognize exactly what that something was, even if you've never been able to name it either. Let's go back to the 1990s for a moment. Not all the way back, just to that specific decade, when tattoos shifted from the margins to the mainstream. Before the 90s, tattoos in America meant something fairly specific. It belonged to bikers and sailors and Vietnam veterans, and people who had made particular choices about which side of culture they wanted to stand on. They were marks of membership, of experience, a life lived outside the expected lines. Then something changed. By the mid-90s, tattoos were everywhere. Music videos, sports, fashion magazines, the friend group, the coworker, the person at the gym. What had been countercultural became simply cultural, and then, eventually, just normal. By the time the decade ended, having a tattoo was no longer a statement. Not having one was starting to become the thing that required explanation. Gen X lived through that entire transition in real time. They were the right age for it. Old enough to remember when tattoos meant something specific. Young enough to be in the middle of the cultural moment when that meaning dissolved. They had to make a decision, consciously or not, about where they stood. A significant number of them made the same quiet choice. No. Not loudly. Not as a protest. Just no. Not for me. Then they went on with their lives and let the world redecorate itself around them. Why? There's a man named Michael. He's 59 now. Grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked at the school board. He describes his childhood household as one where you didn't need to announce yourself. You just showed up and did the work, and people knew who you were from that. He never got a tattoo. Not in his 20s when everyone around him was. Not in his 30s. Not now. When people ask him why, he usually says something about not being able to decide what he'd want permanently on his body. Which is true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth, as he describes it now, is something he's only recently been able to articulate. He didn't want to freeze himself. That's the phrase he uses. Freeze himself. The idea that choosing a symbol or an image and placing it permanently on his body would be, in some way, a declaration that the version of himself at that moment was fixed, settled, done becoming. He was never done becoming. That feeling, the resistance to being permanently marked as any one version of yourself, is not unique to Michael. turns out to be one of the most common psychological threads running through the lives of Gen X adults who never got tattooed. And when you understand it, everything about the choice starts to make sense. American Psychological Association has spent decades studying what they call identity development across the lifespan. The process by which people form, revise, eventually settle into a sense of who they are. Their research reveals something that challenges the common assumption that identity solidifies in your 20s and then stays relatively stable. For many people, particularly those who went through the specific cultural upheavals of the late 20th century, identity continues to shift well into the 40s and 50s. The self doesn't freeze. It keeps becoming. The people who understood this intuitively, who felt in their bones that they were not yet finished, the person they were at 23 was not the whole story. Were often the same people who stood in the tattoo artist's chair, looked at the designs, and quietly decided, not yet, or eventually, not ever. Not because they had nothing to say, because they didn't want to say it in a form that couldn't be revised. But here's the part that most conversations about this completely miss. It wasn't just about identity flexibility. It was about something even more fundamental than that. Something that runs deeper in the psychology of a specific kind of person. Something that has to do with the relationship between the inner life and the outer world. Think about what a tattoo does. At its most basic level, it takes something internal, a belief, a memory, a relationship, identity, a piece of meaning, and moves it to the surface. It externalizes. It announces. It makes visible what was invisible. For many people, that's exactly the point. The announcement is the purpose. Visibility is the value. But there is a particular kind of person for whom the internal and the external have a very different relationship. For whom the inner life is not something to be displayed. Not because it's shameful or secret, but because its value is precisely in its privacy. Its depth comes from not being translated into surface. The Gen X adults who went through their entire lives without ink on their skin are, disproportionately, people who live this way. People whose most important convictions, deepest loyalties, most significant relationships exist primarily in a register that doesn't need to be seen by strangers to be real. Gallup organization has researched what they call internal versus external locus of identity, the degree to which a person's sense of self is located in private experience versus public expression. Their findings across age groups show something fascinating. Adults who score high on internal identity orientation are significantly more likely to have gone through major life transitions, loss, reinvention, sustained adversity, without outwardly signaling those transitions to the people around them. They process internally. They integrate quietly, move forward without needing the world to acknowledge the movement. Does that sound familiar? There's a woman named Sandra, 53, has been a teacher for 26 years in a suburb of Atlanta. She has no tattoos. Never wanted any, she says. But the way she explains it is interesting. She says that the things she cares most about in her life don't need to be on her body, because they're already in everything she does. Her marriage of 28 years, her kids, the students she's taught, the convictions she's held through decades of a world that kept trying to update what it believed and expected everyone else to update along with it. Those things are real whether or not anyone can see them. In fact, she suggests they might be more real precisely because they're not on display, because they haven't been reduced to a symbol. That's not a small idea. And it's not a defensive rationalization. It's actually a fairly sophisticated psychological orientation, one that the research on identity and meaning-making consistently associates with higher levels of what psychologists call integration. The sense that who you are on the inside and how you live on the outside are connected, coherent, real, without requiring any particular external validation. But there's another layer to this. It's the one that tends to surprise people most. Most people assume that the Gen X adults who never got tattoos are at some level more conventional, more risk-averse, more concerned with what other people think of them. The assumption is that clean skin reflects a certain conservatism, a playing it safe mentality. The psychology tells a different story entirely. The NIH's research on conformity and individualism across generational cohorts found something counterintuitive. The adults most resistant to permanent body modification weren't the most conformist. They were, in many cases, among the least. They were people who had developed, often through years of direct experience with cultural pressure, a very clear internal compass that didn't rely on external signals to navigate. In other words, they weren't avoiding tattoos because they worried what other people would think. They were avoiding tattoos because they didn't particularly care what other people thought, including the people who assumed they should be more willing to mark themselves. Think about what that means for a generation that came of age during the most intense period of tattoo normalization in American history. Every year through the 90s and 2000s, the social pressure increased. Every year, the number of people who had them grew. Every year, the question, "Why haven't you?" came with more implied judgment behind it. A certain kind of Gen X adult just kept not caring. Not loudly, not defensively, just with the particular settled indifference of someone whose sense of themselves didn't require anyone else's input to remain stable. That's harder than it sounds, and it's rarer than most people realize. There's something else worth naming here, something that comes from the specific era in which this generation formed. Gen X grew up watching permanence prove unreliable. Their parents' marriages, companies their fathers worked for their entire lives, the neighborhoods they grew up in, the institutions that were supposed to be trustworthy. One by one, across the formative years of their lives, things that were supposed to be permanent turned out not to be. That education in the unreliability of permanence is not something that leaves a person quickly. It becomes, instead, foundational skepticism, not of people exactly, but of fixed states, of declared positions, commitments made in one context that then have to be carried into contexts that the original moment couldn't have anticipated. A tattoo is, among other things, a bet on the future. A bet that what matters to you now will still be recognizable as mattering to you 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. That the symbol that feels true at 23 will still feel true at 55. Gen X watched too many sure things turn out not to be sure to make that bet easily. This isn't pessimism. It's pattern recognition. It's the same pattern recognition that showed up everywhere else in how this generation navigated their lives, in their relationships, their careers, their finances, their politics, their relationship with institutions of every kind. They trusted what they'd seen more than what they were told. And what they'd seen said, "Be careful about what you declare permanent." Pew Research tracking shows that Gen X adults consistently demonstrate higher levels of what researchers call provisional commitment, the ability to be genuinely invested in something without fully closing off the possibility that it might need to be revised. This isn't ambivalence. It's a specific kind of experiential wisdom that develops in people who've watched enough certainties dissolve to know that today's obvious truth can become tomorrow's obvious mistake. Getting a tattoo runs against that disposition in a very direct way. It asks for a form of commitment that Gen X, as a generation, was specifically shaped to be cautious about. And so they didn't. Most of them couldn't have told you all of this in those terms at the time. They just had a feeling, quiet, certain, resistant to full explanation, that it wasn't for them. Feeling was the wisdom expressing itself before the words caught up. Back to the man in the parking lot of the hardware store, loading his truck in the autumn light. Looking at his forearms for a moment. There's something in those forearms. Not ink, not symbols, not declarations. Just skin that has been in the world for 5 or 6 decades, doing the work that life required, gathering its own kind of marks along the way. The kind that can't be removed and can't be replicated, and don't need to be explained to anyone. The scars from the job, the lines from the years, evidence of a life that showed up and kept showing up without needing to announce itself. He drives away. The young man at the register is already helping the next customer. Neither of them thinks much about the other. But something was true in that parking lot. Something that didn't need to be said out loud or written anywhere to be real. The man with the clean arms knows exactly who he is. He's known for a long time, and he never needed to put it anywhere outside himself to make it stick. If something in this video felt like it was describing you or describing something you've always felt but never quite found the words for, then you already understand what this was really about. Not tattoos. Thing underneath tattoos. The question of where a person's identity actually lives, and what it means to carry it privately across a lifetime. That's what this channel is for. The things underneath the surface. The psychology that explains what felt inexplicable. There's more of it here if you want it. There is one more thing worth sitting with before this ends. The question that comes up sometimes, usually late at night, or in a quiet moment that arrives unexpectedly, is whether the choice was actually a choice at all. Whether not getting a tattoo was something decided, or whether it was simply something that never happened, the way a lot of things never happen without anyone consciously deciding against them. That question deserves an honest answer. For some people, clean skin is genuinely accidental. They meant to get one eventually. The time never seemed right. Life moved fast. Now they're 57, and the moment passed so long ago that the question is more or less moot. That's a real thing. And it's fine. It doesn't need to mean anything in particular. For another group, and this is the group that this video is really about, the absence of ink is not accidental. It's the result of something consistent, something that expressed itself again and again across decades whenever the question came up, something that said, no, not for me, not this. The difference between those two experiences is significant. Only the person inside the skin knows which one it is. If you're in the second group, if something in you has always simply known that marking your body permanently wasn't a thing you were going to do, without being fully able to explain why, then what's worth understanding is that this knowing wasn't random. It wasn't a personality defect, or a failure of imagination, or an excess of caution. It was a specific orientation towards identity, toward permanence, toward the relationship between who you are and how much of that needs to be visible to the world. That orientation has served this particular group of people in more ways than they're often aware of. It's the same orientation that kept them from making other permanent decisions impulsively, from declaring positions too early, from burning bridges that they might have needed later, from tattooing themselves metaphorically, ideas or allegiances or identities that the next decade would have made them want to remove. The body was just the most literal expression of a trait that ran through everything. It was a woman, her name isn't important, who sat in a tattoo parlor in Seattle in 1994. She was 27. Her friends had all gone before her. She had the design picked out. She was ready. And then she looked around the room, at the other people getting inked, at the flash art on the walls, at the artist's arms covered completely, a full visual autobiography from elbow to shoulder. She thought, In 20 years, will any of this still be the same? Not the tattoos specifically. Everything. The music that felt like life itself. The friendships that felt permanent. The person she was in that moment, so certain about what mattered and why. She stood up, thanked the artist. Left 20 years later, she was 57. Living in a city she hadn't expected to live in. House. Married to someone she hadn't yet met in 1994. With a life that bore almost no surface resemblance to the one she was living when she walked out of that Seattle parlor. But the person inside that life, the one who had known to wait, to stay unwritten, to resist the pressure to declare herself finished before she was, that person had been consistent through all of it. It's the thing that doesn't go on the skin. The thing that persists beneath every change. The thing that was always there, quietly, doing its work, whether or not anyone outside could see it. That's identity, not as performance, not as declaration, as something lived rather than displayed. For the Gen X adults who spent their lives carrying theirs without external marking, who built families and careers and relationships and convictions on the foundation of something no one could see unless they really looked. The reward isn't visible either. Just is. Quietly, certainly. In the particular way of things that were never going to need anyone else's eyes to be real. The man is home now. The truck is in the driveway. The hardware store bags are on the workbench in the garage. He's got a project to finish, the way he always has a project to finish, the way the work of a life never really stops just because you got older. He rolls up his sleeves, clean arms, a few old scars, the marks that time puts on a person whether they choose them or not. He picks up his tools and gets to work. That's enough. That's always been enough. This channel is the kind of thing that speaks to you. Psychology that takes ordinary human experience seriously and tries to find what's actually underneath it. Then there's more of it waiting here. Take your time with it.